Everybody, and welcome to this revision video on the human brain. In this video, I'll talk about localization, so the different responsibilities of different parts of the brain, the different lobes, hemispheres, and so on, as well as some deeper structures of the brain as well. This is part of the neuropsychology topic for stage 1 psychology. Let's get started. So some background information first. So the brain is encased in the skull. It weighs approximately 1.5 kilograms or 3 pounds. The gap between the brain and the skull is filled with fluid called cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, and this helps to protect against head knocks and head injuries, to protect the brain itself. So we've gained a lot of valuable information from studies, or case studies I should say, of living people with brain damage. So looking at their brain injury and where their brain was actually affected, and then their subsequent behaviour in terms of the difficulty that they are facing and loss of function of some sort, we're able to then pinpoint what parts of the brain are responsible for what functions. So it is difficult to gain information from people who have passed away in terms of localization and responsibilities of certain parts of the brain, in other words. So a lot of valuable information that we have gained are from people who are still alive but have suffered with brain image or brain trauma, because it then helps us in neuropsychology to pinpoint what part of the brain is responsible for what function. So the brain is described as having three main regions. So we've got our hindbrain, which is at the back of our head. We've got our midbrain in the middle and our forebrain obviously at the front. And our forebrain is the biggest part of our brain. So each region controls its own identifiable behaviors. As I've said, this is called localization. So let's start with the hindbrain first, which is comprised of the cerebellum, the medulla, and the pons. So the cerebellum is a fist-sized portion of the brain located at the back of the head, pictured here. So its function is to coordinate voluntary muscle movements and to maintain posture, balance, and equilibrium. So we know that the cerebellum is responsible for movements, so coordinated movements and involuntary movements as well. So it makes rapid calculations about which muscles should be activated and by how much to perform complicated tasks. So this is so movements can be smooth and fluid and not jerky and uncoordinated, as I've said there. Now, there is new information and new studies that are currently underway that are looking at the cerebellum's roles in emotions as well as addiction, autism, and schizophrenia. But as I said before, we're still in the very early stages of that, and it is difficult to make conclusions on that at the moment. But what we do know is that the cerebellum is responsible for movements. So more information will come out about the other responsibilities the cerebellum may have, as I've got listed there, but we'll have to wait and see what the conclusions are at this stage. So damage to the cerebellum will result in difficulty in coordinating movements, such as walking, kicking, riding a bike, and maintaining balance. So this is also why driving and movement is impaired after drinking a large sum of alcohol, because it affects the cerebellum directly. So when we're very, very drunk or we've had a lot of alcohol, we often stumble around and are able to coordinate our movements. And that's because our cerebellum is affected by the alcohol and we're unable then to coordinate our movements when we are drunk. Unfortunately, long-term alcohol abuse can lead to a shrinking of the cerebellum itself, as pictured here. Then we have our medulla. So this is at the bottom of our brainstem. And the medulla is where the brain meets the spinal cord, as well as the pons, which I'll talk about soon. So the medulla is essential to our survival because it regulates many involuntary bodily activities, including our heartbeat or heart rhythm, our breathing rate, our blood flow, oxygen and carbon dioxide levels, and the list goes on. But these are the main functions that we've been able to identify. So the medulla produces reflective activities as well, such as sneezing, vomiting, coughing, and swallowing. So these are obviously mainly involuntary behaviors or involuntary actions. So it's the medulla that coordinates all of this, hence the medulla is essential to our survival. So damage to our medulla, therefore, is often fatal, which is probably not surprising. So large doses of drugs such as heroin, cocaine, or amphetamines affect the normal functioning of the medulla. This will lead to the interruption or dangerous low levels of breathing and heartbeat, which then leads to drug overdose. So it's the medulla that's affected because of the involuntary functions that it's responsible for. We have our pons, which is the last part of our hindbrain section. So it is part of the brainstem. It is the structure that connects the spinal cord to the brain. All right, so it is going back to our central nervous system there. It connects the brain to the spinal cord. It allows the cerebellum to communicate with the rest of the brain, and it also works together with a structure called the medulla, what I've just talked about, which sits just below it in the brainstem to coordinate breathing. It's also believed that rapid eye movement, or REM, which is our dreaming sleep that we have each night, relies on the function of the pons. Now, we know that rapid eye movement and sleep is also linked to the pineal gland and the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is in the hypothalamus, which I'll talk about later. But new emerging research now reveals that rapid eye movement relies on the functioning of the pons as well. So damage to the pons is again often fatal. There are diseases that affect the small vessels in the pons that can lead to pontine strokes, causing an intracerebral hemorrhage or bleeding in the brain. So the function of the pons can also be impacted by brain tumors, concussion, or infections. And damage to the pons, like I said, is often fatal, with the mortality rates at about 40 or 50%. In survivors, the damage to different areas of the pons will affect the body differently. It depends on each individual case study. Some common symptoms include a lack of coordination, double vision, paralysis, and nausea. So moving on now to the midbrain. So the midbrain, as you can see here, sits at the top of the medulla and is associated with vision, hearing, arousal, temperature regulation, and the sleep-wake cycle. So within the midbrain is our hypothalamus and other deeper structures, which I'll talk about later in this video. So we also know the midbrain plays a role in the movement of the eyes and the eyelids, as well as processing auditory and visual signals before they are passed on to key areas in the forebrain, which again, I'll talk about later in this video. So the midbrain also regulates alertness and is believed to be involved in suppressing pain. So deep in the midbrain is also a structure called the substantia nigra, which is a cluster of neurons with a dark pigment. And it's these cells within this tissue that create the neurotransmitter dopamine, which is needed for the coordination of movement. We also know dopamine is a feel-good neurotransmitter. It makes us feel very pleasant and very nice. And the substantia nigra is the area of the brain damaged by Parkinson's disease. So we know that Parkinson's disease is when the dopamine receptors die, and therefore dopamine is not able to be transmitted. I talk about that a little bit more in my next video, which is on brain illness and injury. So moving on to the forebrain, which is comprised mainly of the cerebrum and the cerebral cortex. So the forebrain is the largest portion of our brain. It makes up 90% of it, as you can see here. It contains the entire cerebrum, as well as the thalamus, hypothalamus, pineal gland, and limbic system, which sit beneath it. So the forebrain controls reproductive functions, sleeping, eating, emotions, and body temperature. It's also the part of the brain responsible for thinking, reasoning, and processing and learning. So the majority of the forebrain is the cerebrum, which is, again, the largest part of the brain, as you can see here. So looking at the cerebrum, okay, it is the front of the brain, and it's comprised of grey matter, which is the cerebral cortex, and white matter at its centre. At the time of me filming this, we've done a brain dissection on a sheep's brain, and you could clearly see the difference between the grey matter and the white matter. So it is the largest part of the brain. The cerebrum initiates and coordinates movement and regulates temperature. We know that through localization case studies. Other areas of the cerebrum enable speech, judgment, thinking and reasoning, problem solving, emotions and learning. So damage to the cerebrum will then cause difficulties in one or more of these areas. Other functions relate to vision, hearing, touch and other senses. So the cerebral cortex, so the word cortex is Latin for bark, and it describes the outer grey matter covering the brain, as you can see here. So the cortex has a large surface area due to its many folds and comprises about half of the brain's weight. So it's directly beneath the cerebral cortex is a region of highly concentrated neurons called basal ganglia. And these cells assist in the coordination of movement by filtering messages sent by the brain to ensure only necessary signals are acted upon and incorrect transmissions are ignored. So in my previous video, I talked about, or my previous videos, I should say, I talked about a lot of external and internal stimuli that we are receiving. So as you can see here, these cells determine which ones are necessary or which signals should be acted upon and carried out through neural transmission and which ones should be ignored. So disruption or malfunction of the basal ganglia forms the basis of several movement disorders, including Parkinson's disease, which I've mentioned already, epilepsy, and Huntington's disease. So the cerebral cortex is divided into the left and right hemispheres. So the left hemisphere receives sensory information from the right side of the body and controls movement on the right side, and vice versa. So the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, and the right side of the body, as I've said, and the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. So each hemisphere is divided further into 4 lobes, pictured here. So the frontal, parietal, occipital, and the temporal lobe. Let's go into these in more detail. Here's another visual. So we've got our left hemisphere, right hemisphere. So the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body. The right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. And then we have our different lobes here. So the frontal lobe at the front of the brain, the parietal lobe towards the back, the occipital lobe right at the very back above the cerebellum, and the temporal lobe on the sides, or temporal lobes, I should say, on the sides. So let's go into these. So the frontal lobe is the largest lobe of the brain, located in the front of the head. It's involved in personality characteristics, so extroversion, introversion, neuroticism, etc. It's also involved in decision-making and movements. It's also responsible for the recognition of smell, usually involved parts, or recognition of smell, I should say, is involved with parts of the frontal lobe. It also contains Broca's area, which is associated with speech ability, which I talk about in more detail in my brain injury and illness video. Now, our parietal lobes is at the back of the head, as you can see here, or towards the back. So it's the middle to back end of the brain. The parietal lobe helps a person identify objects and understand spatial relationships. It's also involved in interpreting pain and touch within the body. And this particular part of the brain, so the parietal lobe, protects the Wernicke's area, which helps the brain understand spoken language. So we know that the parietal lobe is very much involved in language, so understanding spoken language and interpreting the language from others. The occipital lobe is located at the back of the brain, as you can see here, and this is involved with vision and eyesight. And the temporal lobes are at the sides of the brain, as you can see here, and we know that they're involved in short-term memory, speech, musical rhythm, and some degree of smell recognition because they are next to the frontal lobe. Now, there are some deeper brain structures that I will also go through. So the pituitary gland, the hypothalamus, the amygdala, the cingulate gyrus, the hippocampus, and the pineal gland. So the pituitary gland is sometimes called the master gland, pictured here, deep within the brain. It is a pea-sized structure found deep in the brain, as I've said, behind the bridge of the nose. So this governs the function of other glands in the body, regulating the flow of hormones from the thyroid, adrenals, ovaries, and testicles. So it receives chemical signals from the hypothalamus through its stalk and blood supply. So it's responsible for a lot of bodily functions, hence why it's often called the master gland. We then have our hypothalamus pictured here. It's located just above the pituitary gland and regulates body temperature. It helps synchronize sleep patterns, so we know that's where our SCN is. For those of you who have heard me talk about sleep, that's where our suprachiasmatic nucleus is located. It controls hunger and thirst and also plays a role in some aspects of memory and emotion. We then have our amygdala, which is a small almond-shaped structure, as you can see here. They're located under each half or each hemisphere of the brain. So our amygdala, so the plural, regulates emotions and memory and are associated with the brain's reward system. Also stress and the flight or fight response when someone perceives a threat, which I've talked about previously in my peripheral nervous system video. Our amygdala also, it's thought, is responsible for what we call evocative memories or flashbulb memories, which are memories that have a lot of emotion attached to them. So flashbulb memories being very, very emotional or evocative memories. It's thought that our amygdala plays a role in those sorts of memories exclusively. We then have our cingulate gyrus. So this is the curved fold here in green, covering the corpus callosum, which attaches the two hemispheres together. So a component of the limbic system, it's involved in processing emotions and behavior regulation. It also helps to regulate the autonomic motor functions, which I've talked about before. So it coordinates sensory input with emotions, regulates aggressive behavior, communication, maternal bonding, language expression, and decision making. So if the cingulate gyrus is damaged, one or all of these things may be affected. Then we have our hippocampus. So this is a curved seahorse-shaped organ on the underside of each temporal lobe. We know that this supports memory, long-term memory specifically, learning, navigation, and the perception of space. It also receives information from the cerebral cortex and may play a role in Alzheimer's disease. More study is needed on that, though, to be conclusive. And then we have our pineal gland, which is located deep in the brain and attached by a stalk to the top of the third ventricle, pictured here. It's a very small structure, about the size of a pea. This responds to light and dark and secretes melatonin, which regulates our circadian rhythms and the sleep-wake cycle. So the SCN, or our pineal gland, will release melatonin when there is darkness and stop the secretion of melatonin when there is light. Because we are daytime animals, it helps to coordinate our sleep-wake cycle based on light and time of day. So those are the main structures of the brain in this video. I hope you found this useful. As always, if you've got any questions, please shoot me an email or ask me in class. Otherwise, happy revising.